Hello, and welcome again to Ethics and Leadership. So today we're covering Mary Wollstonecraft, and behind me I have a picture of what's called the Women's March. The Women's March was an early event in the French Revolution where lower-class women were protesting the high price of bread in France. They eventually ransacked an armory and carried the arms with them to Versailles, where they pressed the king for relief. The king promised them relief, but then headed off to Paris. He never made it back to Versailles again, and I think we all know how it ended for him with the whole... I don't think he couldn't make it sound like that after. Okay, in any case, he died in the French Revolution. This brings together two different themes that are really important for Wollstonecraft. One is the overthrow of aristocratic and monarchical systems in favor of democracy. The second is the rising power of women as we come into modernity. But before we get to Wollstonecraft, I want to lay a little ground first. So, Alexis de Tocqueville, whose first name should have been Alexis, except for that he was French, and you don't have to pronounce the end of words in French. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in his two-volume work, Democracy in America, that the history of politics is in fact the history of the progress of equality. So equality moving throughout society, society becoming more and more equal. Well, if he meant economic equality, that really isn't true, as economic equality has fluctuated a great deal and has at times, like the present, reached extremes which have been unknown throughout the history of human existence. But if he meant in terms of natural rights, those kinds of things that John Locke had laid out that keep people separate from each other and out of each other's way, well, he probably has a point, at least internal to modernity. You see, Locke started us out with that basic claim, all men are created equal. But working out exactly what that means has taken us a long time, and a significant amount of struggle, as more and more people have claimed membership in the category of man, or, as we said in our last lecture, could be humanity. So first, we'll discuss some of the efforts of women to move into that category, and then we'll discuss the effort of blacks to move into that category in our next lecture with Frederick Douglass. In order to do this, we're going to have to discuss feminism. And I know that that word is uncomfortable for some people, so I want to take this on head on. What I mean when I talk about feminism, and I think what most people mean when they talk about feminism, is the active effort to gain women equal rights, or the active effort to deconstruct patriarchy in any particular society. And here, patriarchy is an established system that places men above women. Now, I know that feminism is an essentially contested term in our society, by which I mean it's a political term. It gets used in order to make emotional arguments for one or another political position. And in this process, there's a significant argument about what it means. So, some people assert that feminism is actually the effort to place women above men, or to give women more rights than men have. Although there are doubtless some people who call themselves feminists who hold such positions, this is not what the majority of people who call themselves feminists mean by the term. Rather, they mean trying to bring women to equal status with men as persons with dignity and basic rights recognized by society. This is the definition that I'm going to accept for this class, and if you agree with it, if you think that women in fact should have equal rights with men, then count yourself as a feminist in the terms that I'm using. Now, beyond that, there will be a great deal of question about what kind of feminist you are. because there are all sorts of different kinds of feminists and all sorts of different positions that fit within feminism as a broad category. So, for instance, do you believe that women are just exactly the same as men in terms of their power and their rights, and so we shouldn't treat them differently at all from each other? Do you believe that women are equally rational with men, and this is the basis of their equal dignity and equal rights? Or do you believe that women are different from men and yet equal in some way, such that women have special roles or special abilities that men don't have, and maybe men have special roles and ability that women don't have, but in general they should be treated equal and equal in terms of their rights? These positions are all different varieties of feminism. And as we get into today, we're going to explore Mary Wollstonecraft and her particular vision of feminism. I will highlight some of the places where her picture of feminism does not necessarily line up with everyone else's, and where she made decisions that might be somewhat questionable in terms of contemporary feminist theory. But no place along the line will we use feminist in a derogatory way, or use the term to represent anyone who is arguing for a fundamental inequality between the sexes. Okay, all of that said, let's put Wollstonecraft back in her own historical context so that we can understand not only what she's doing as a feminist or a proto-feminist, but also more generally what her philosophy was doing. Because she was not just a proto-feminist, but she was an active philosopher who went back and forth with some of the philosophical heavyweights of her day, like Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine. These are the people that she argued with in public, which is impressive, whether or not you're a woman. Wollstonecraft is most famous for her arguments with Edmund Burke. Now, these arguments occurred during the beginning of the French Revolution. It was during the People's Uprisings and before the Reign of Terror. So this is before they'd started killing people with the guillotine and letting their heads roll in France. They weren't entirely sure what direction this revolution was going to take, and some people identified it with the American Revolution, which had come out in a fairly peaceful development of a new democratic state. But others argued that the French Revolution was significantly different. Amongst those who argued that the French Revolution was different was a guy named Edmund Burke. Now, Edmund Burke was a conservative, by which I don't mean those small government people who run around today calling themselves conservatives. He was actually a conservative, in the usual sense of the term, meaning to conserve, to want to maintain tradition. Burke was, in fact, against quick change in any direction. Edmund Burke was opposed to the optimism of Enlightenment figures like John Locke, who thought all people had access to a natural law that could give them the rules by which society should be governed. Burke himself thought that human beings were not really smart enough to clear everything away and start over with a new political society. He wasn't a Hobbesian. He didn't believe that he knew what the state of nature might look like, nor did he believe that that was a useful experiment. Rather, he thought that the ability to live together in peace was something that humans developed over time by small experiments in order to establish particular traditions that reigned in evil and allowed for a stable society. This development into a stable society was hard won, and even if someone was not entirely happy with the order in which they lived, they shouldn't try going back to zero, because that would get rid of everything that had been achieved so far in terms of establishing order. So Burke favored, well, basically whatever traditions were in place. Now, this didn't mean that you couldn't change things, but if you change things, they should be fairly small changes, and they should go about at a moderate pace. Burke actually came out in favor of the American Revolution because he did not see that as a radical break with history. From his view, the founding fathers of the United States were basically an extension of the kind of aristocratic democracy that had developed in England. They already knew about the basic institutions of English society, and he saw that they would make a government that basically paralleled the English system, with a legislature and an executive and a constitutional system that they actually wrote down. So Burke didn't have that many problems with that. But the French, well, they had no time for this kind of moderate progress. In France, there was an absolute monarchy, and the people decided that they wanted to entirely get rid of it. This struck Burke as one of the worst possible ideas. So he wrote a book arguing against the French Revolution and praising the members of the Ancien Regime, which means the ancient regime of the monarchy and the nobility. Now, in the long run, Burke might have had a point. All of this argument was taking place before the Reign of Terror broke out in France, and everything kind of went to chaos and anarchy. But Burke's position made him no friends among radical Democrats, either in England or in France. And one of those radical Democrats at the time was Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft was largely a self-educated philosopher. She found the restrictions of English society somewhat repressive, and had learned fairly early that if women want equality, they're going to have to fight for it. She had in fact liberated her sister from an abusive husband. Wollstonecraft sought to establish her own ability to provide for herself, first by founding a school, which eventually failed, and then through her own publications, which was a remarkable thing for a woman at the time. But this being a philosophy course, I'm not as interested in Wollstonecraft's biography as I am in her ideas. And her argument with Burke goes back to exactly those grounds on which he would have disagreed with Locke. Because Wollstonecraft is a supreme believer in the natural law. There is, she believes, a natural law that is accessible to all people, and by that she means men and women. So the problem that she has to explain is why women have been subjugated to men for so long. Her answer here had to do with enculturation that occurs through education. She believed that the unequal education given to women and men was in fact the source of any apparent inequalities between them. If you gave them equal educations, she said, they would in fact have equal intellectual powers, equal ability to grasp the natural law, and this would allow women to be better participants in the society. Involved in this is Wollstonecraft's criticism of what we could consider an ideological prison, or a patriarchal prison, which existed not only on the level of external institutions in the society, but reached all the way into the mind. If we go all the way back to Plato, you might remember that Plato had suggested that in order to get people to accept their places in society, that they might need to put forward a kind of royal or noble lie that they would tell the people about how the people were made of different metals and how this shaped their own essences towards their particular jobs. And he assumed that once people had internalized this, maybe not in the first generation, but as you go down to the second generation, it would just become a part of the culture that people would accept. Well, Wollstonecraft thinks that something like this has happened to women. Society has taught women that women are all about external beauty rather than internal rationality. They're about trying to get and attract a spouse rather than standing and thinking on their own. And they've taught these things for so long that women have in fact internalized it, that it's become something that women accept. Now, a couple of things are worth noting here. For one, Wollstonecraft has no illusions that all females will be feminists in the sense that we're talking about here, because she believes most females have been programmed by their society to think about themselves in particular ways, to think about themselves in ways that support claims about their inequality. Another point here is that in many ways Wollstonecraft, in developing this picture, overlaps with Marx and Marx's criticism of ideology, which we'll see in an upcoming lecture. So keep your eye open for that. Now, you might have picked up through the first couple slides on Wollstonecraft that she's big on reason. And man, is she. Wollstonecraft is a kind of a rationalist, although exactly the kind of rationalist she is the subject of some argument in today's scholarship. But before I say something about that, let me say something about the general strategy that Wollstonecraft is adopting here. Throughout the history of philosophical and political thought, there has been a general picture which associates men with rationality and women with the appetites, men with the soul and women with the body. Now, in order to counter that, you could move in several different ways. You could, for instance, accept that this is the case, that men are more rational and women more passional, men more associated with thought and women more associated with body, and you could fight for equality by just then celebrating the body and celebrating passional aspects of yourself. You could deny the dichotomy, moving in somewhat of an Aristotelian direction, ironically, in suggesting that there's a greater commerce between the appetites and the reason than the picture of male and female in this dichotomy imagines, and suggesting that, as a matter of fact, each one can gain from the other, or perhaps everybody needs to find a better balance in their lives. Wollstonecraft did not take either one of these strategies, however. Her approach was generally to accept the superiority of rationality over the appetites and the body, and to argue that women were as capable of rationality as males. So she aligns herself with a classical position which holds the superiority of rationality, but disregards the deprecation of females that came about on the basis of this superiority of rationality. This was not an entirely new move at the time. In fact, Wollstonecraft drew in part from Catherine Macaulay, another woman of the time who was doing significant work in history. Macaulay had drawn on Stoicism, and Stoic ideas, both about equality of the sexes. If we go back to the Stoics, we'll remember that it was the early Stoics who pushed for equality, but also Stoic ideas about the superiority of reason. You'll remember that the early Stoics held that, in fact, the worst form of slavery was slavery to your own appetites. And so, it was always better and always more free to accept reason's rule over you and reject the appetites, whatever your actual social position. It's not clear whether Wollstonecraft ever actually read the Stoics, but she certainly did read Catherine Macaulay's summary of the Stoics, and generally agreed that to be free was in fact to be free in the sense that rationality was in charge, rather than the passions. So in this, she actually drives in a kind of Platonic direction, or a Stoic direction. One more issue where Wollstonecraft overlaps with the Stoics would be in terms of cosmopolitanism. Now, this isn't the term that Wollstonecraft herself used. She used terms like universal love or universal benevolence. This indicates her dependence on the Christian tradition, and the way that the Christian tradition had put together the idea of overturning standard hierarchies with the Stoic position of cosmopolitanism early on in the Christian religion. Notably, some other women in the period, like Macaulay, were making similar moves and doing it explicitly in terms of uniting Christian universality with Stoic cosmopolitanism. So that Wollstonecraft moves in this direction is not really surprising. Now, Wollstonecraft is often associated with proto-feminism, or being the mother of feminism today, but to look at her in that way actually reduces her political position. Wollstonecraft was against natural hierarchy in general, and against divinely appointed hierarchy, and against, well, she was pretty much against most forms of hierarchy. I mean, I imagine that she was a Democrat, so she could accept like hierarchies that you agreed to, but none that were given to you from someplace outside of yourself. This was the root of her favoritism for the French Revolution, where she saw the people rising up and taking out the nobles, the aristocrats, the monarchy, and establishing something new, a new equality in society. And she thought that this was, in fact, a move in the right direction, because she believed that these natural hierarchies stand against the natural law and the natural rights of humanity. Here she can sound very much like Locke. So in opposition to Burke, she believed that people were, in fact, intelligent enough and rational enough to know the goods that they deserved, and to recognize that their political society was wrong and have some idea of how to improve upon it. The people, the general populace, were trustworthy, she believed, in order to bring about political change. And here, her position is not that much different from several other radicals of the time, like Thomas Paine, who was active in America, where he wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, which was one of the best propaganda pieces in favor of the American Revolution, but who then argued himself against Burke and in favor of the French Revolution. What made Wollstonecraft especially radical was the fact that she actually wanted to carry the principles of the Revolution on out for women. So she protests in the beginning of her vindication of the rights of women to the French politician Talleyrand that their constitution complains about inequality, and yet they haven't actually addressed the problem of inequality for women. She says, "You observed that to see one half of the human race excluded by the other from all participation in government was a political phenomenon, that, according to abstract principles, it was impossible for you to explain. If so, on what does your constitution rest? If the abstract rights of man will bear discussion and explanation, those of women, by a parity of reasoning, will not shrink from the same test." So basically what she's saying is, look, you made a fundamental argument when you rose up against the king, which was, you can't leave half of the people out of politics. Now there, Talleyrand was thinking about the lower classes and how they were unable to participate in France's hierarchical system of government. But Wollstonecraft uses this exact line to turn against Talleyrand and the rest of the radicals who were not also in favor of women's rights, to say you can't actually argue that and then leave women out of having their own rights and participation in politics, because there the argument is exactly the same. Key to Wollstonecraft's argument is pointing out the hypocrisy of those who would support equality in one sense and would not in another. Here we might think back to Locke and the claim that all men are created equal, and the founding fathers who put that on into the Declaration of Independence. Well, if you're going to claim that, and then you're going to deny some human beings their fundamental rights, this seems to be a problem. Here we see the unrolling of what Alexis de Tocqueville might have called the spread of equality throughout society. If you're going to make the argument, you have to stand by it in all cases. Otherwise, you aren't rational. And note what you've developed your distinction between women and men upon: the claim that you're rational. It's a brilliant, brilliant argument. Nor did Wollstonecraft's attacks on hierarchy stop at the level of politics. She refused to make the family an area that was independent from discussions of justice. She believes that the problem with marriage is that it is too based upon the appetites, that women and men have been trained to see marriage as an outlet for their passions, rather than as a rational relationship between two equal people. Wollstonecraft believed that marriage should be based on rational friendship, rather than any idea of passionate love, because she believed that passionate love would in fact pass as you got deeper and deeper into the relationship, whereas rational friendship would be able to endure. So, in short, people should marry their friends and not their lovers. There is doubtless some truth to this position. As a married person, I can tell you that love is not just about good feelings and passions. It's also about a duty that people have to each other. And this is an important aspect that can be lost in any overly romantic or passionate view of marriage. But one might still question whether this picture is a little bit too rationalistic, maybe a little bit too Augustinian in its deprecation of the role of passion and enjoyment in human life. This kind of critique of Wollstonecraft would be accepted by some later feminists, those who in fact want to celebrate the passions and the body more in their own versions of feminism. But returning to the broader theme of Wollstonecraft's political philosophy and opposition to hierarchy that goes beyond feminism, it's important to note that Wollstonecraft also was critical of inequality, economic inequality. And here's a place where she moves in a different direction from John Locke, who had articulated rights to life, liberty, and property, but had not particularly seen inequality as one of the problems that he should be worried about, or one of those problems that could be dealt with on the terms of natural law morality. Wollstonecraft was a great writer, and some of her most striking passages come out when she addresses the problems of inequality in society. Hell stalks abroad, the lash resounds on the slave's naked sides, and the sick wretch, who can no longer earn the sour bread of unremitting labor, steals to a ditch to bid the world a long good night. That's a hell of a sentence. In later scholarship about Wollstonecraft, there has been an argument about to what extent her critique of inequality is tied up with her critique of aristocratic and monarchical inequality. So certainly, many of the times that she critiques economic inequality, it is because economic inequality has come about because of feudalistic economic structures that gave power to lords, kings, and nobility above the common peasantry. And at times she even goes so far as to suggest that the land of the nobles and the monarchy should in fact be broken up into parcels and given away to those people who have been members of the peasantry so that they can move in and take it as their own private property. She also has similar ideas for public lands. She and Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, would not get along well, Teddy Roosevelt being the one who started the national parks, because she believes that those public lands should be opened up for the peasantry to come and take their own places. This, however, may be compatible with the basic system of Lockean government, because the nobility and the monarchy do not appear to have gained their acquisitions justly in Locke's system. So breaking up their land and allowing others to have it may be a question of just penalty, of just recompense. Since they have done something wrong, they may now owe it to other people. So a central question is whether Wollstonecraft's critique of economic inequality goes beyond this. There are some reasons to believe, at least later in her life, as she saw monarchies and nobility fall, but yet saw continuing inequality in the developing democratic world, that she did in fact think that there were continuing problems with this inequality. Tyranny of wealth is still more galling and debasing than that of rank, she said in one of her works that came after the vindication of the rights of women. Here, I think we have to assume that Wollstonecraft's account of natural rights goes beyond Locke's, so that she believes that people have some kind of right to equal access to goods. Unfortunately, this ends up being an underdeveloped idea, one that's merely nascent in her thought. Perhaps this makes sense, as she considered her primary fight as against feudal society, and only later came to realize the problems that modern and democratic societies might face. We'll see this kind of argument much further developed by the time we get to Marx. Now let's place some qualifications into Wollstonecraft's opposition to hierarchy and difference. While Wollstonecraft felt that females and males had equality in rights and character, she did not believe that females and males had equality in power. She was willing to accept that males in general have more muscle and are stronger than females, and so males might be able to do some things that females could not. And this is a point at which some later feminists will want to push harder against the essentialization of male and female, by which I mean the assumption that there is like one typical male and one typical female, so that we could talk about males being stronger than females, when obviously it's the case that there are some females that are stronger than most males, just as there are some males that are stronger than most females, and back and forth. So there will be questions here about Wollstonecraft's generalization of the relation of the sexes to each other. It's also important to note that in some ways, Wollstonecraft can come out sounding extremely traditional in comparison to contemporary feminism and the contemporary world in general. While she wanted to make marriage a more egalitarian institution in claiming that the man and the woman should be friends, and that they should hold each other in equal regard, should be equally rational, etc., she did recognize that there were distinctive functions that each one of them would have to fulfill in order to participate in the marriage. With most of her society, she accepted that women in fact had a duty to marriage and pregnancy. And she didn't go so far as to celebrate women who decided not to get married and go without relationships. Of course, while her writings here can come off as somewhat conservative, her own life was a little bit more liberal. She herself flouted the institution of marriage at several points. She got romantically involved with a married man and suggested that he, and her wife should all move in together, which didn't strike his wife as a good idea, so it didn't work out. Then she had several non-married relationships with men, one of which gave her her first daughter out of wedlock. And only towards the end of her life did she actually settle down into a marriage where she had her second daughter and died, unfortunately, due to childbirth. Regardless of her picture on marriage, in general, Wollstonecraft was for sexual integration and equality. This meant that she wanted not only equal education, but integrated education. Women and men studying together in the same place. This will be a continuing question for different minorities as they fight for their own rights. Is it best to seek integration into the society, or is it best to seek to improve on your own, separate from the society? Here's an issue that feminists will continue to disagree on as they move forward. But Wollstonecraft was certainly for complete integration. She included the workspace with this, where she believed that women and men should work next to each other in the same jobs. As a matter of fact, she had a kind of idealized picture where eventually you would get localized businesses that families would in fact run themselves, so husbands and wives would work next to each other in the same jobs. So I've mentioned a couple of times in passing the problem of essentialism, and whether females will want to accept the basic framework of rationality and irrationality, strength and weakness that had served to put women into positions of inequality for so long, and try and use those in order to gain equality. This was definitely Wollstonecraft's approach. As I've noted, she wanted to contend not that rationality wasn't so great or it wasn't self-enclosed, but rather that women were as capable of rationality as men were. This brings us to Wollstonecraft's use of the term masculinity and at times manliness, because she uses these terms in order to refer to women who are claiming their own rights. In some sense, she was willing to say that the masculine female was in fact a kind of ideal for the female as well. At one point in a letter, she referred to her daughter as being so manly that one day she might write the sequel to The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Again, we can see here her strategy, which is basically to take all of those terms that have been used to oppress women over time and to relocate them in ways that women can use them to claim their own equality. However, it will be questioned by some whether this is the best strategy to take for women who want to gain their own equality. Should women, in fact, claim masculinity for themselves? Or should they claim femininity? Or should we just get rid of these words entirely as signifiers because they seem to essentialize that there is one kind of man and one kind of woman? These are all issues which will be taken up in later feminism. All right, at this point, let's put Wollstonecraft in touch with the themes for our class. So, human nature. Humans are rational, sensitive animals. They depend upon proper education, and we could add enculturation, to achieve fulfillment. Here we find a position that's similar to Locke's. However, she would press that human here means everyone, males and females, where Locke left that somewhat ambiguous. Social or individual? Well, humans are individuals who are dependent upon God, and they're dependent upon the way their society shapes them, because some people will come up through the educational system and the cultural system and be distorted by it into the image of the patriarchal society which has raised them. People and property. The ideal life is one of economic security, but not extravagance. She doesn't want you to get carried away by your appetites. We should focus on character and virtue rather than outward appearance and wealth. And the accumulation of wealth of nobles should certainly be redistributed to society. As I noted, in some of her later arguments, she may go beyond this in favor of equality in general, even in the democratic society, although those arguments are not entirely formulated. Equality and inequality. Humans are born equal in rights, but they are different in their powers. Here we can think of males and females, as she said, as being different in their fundamental strength. They have distinctive duties depending upon sex, but labor should be integrated and all should have equal access to intellectual development. The shape of government. Here Wollstonecraft was opposed to rule of the nobility, rule of the monarchy, and in favor of democracy or some form of republic. The purpose of government: to protect the natural rights of all citizens, male and female, and to allow for their participation in the government. So what authorizes government? Well, here we have to imagine that she would go along basically with Locke to say that government has to be approved by consent of the governed, but we can also say that with Locke, she is in favor of rebellion against any government that does not in fact fulfill its purpose in defending the rights of all peoples. Unfortunately, after Wollstonecraft's death, her husband published a biography of her. Now, he was kind of a radical himself, and he saw it as a wonderful testament to her life. But in it, he went over her extramarital affairs, her first daughter being born out of wedlock, and so on. And in the society of the day, perhaps in the patriarchal society of the day, all of this crushed Wollstonecraft's reputation. So after her death, she was not a favored source, even in fairly radical circles. But her thought later came to be reclaimed, especially as feminism reemerged into society and women moved more and more to claim their rights for voting and then beyond. And today we can celebrate Wollstonecraft not only as a proto-feminist, but as a significant political philosopher of her time who was wrestling with the big issues and wrestling against many of the big minds of her own society. All right, that's what I have for this lecture. I'll come back in a moment with our discussion of Frederick Douglass.